Bonjour tout le monde. Good morning, everyone. Je suis très heureux d'être ici, joint virtuellement
I'm
par
very
la
happy to be
vice-première
here,
ministre
joined virtually
Freeland,
by
les
Deputy Prime
ministres
Minister
Blair
Freeland,
et Lametti,
as well
ainsi
as
que
Ministers
par le
Blair
député
and
Lightbound pour parler de
Lametti,
notre nouvelle
in addition
législation
to
sur les armes à
MP
feu.
Lightbound to talk
Mais
about our
avant,
new firearms
j'aimerais
legislation.
commencer par
Before,
faire une
I'd like to
courte mise à
start with a
jour
short
sur la
update
COVID-19
on
et les vaccins.
COVID-19 and
This
vaccines.
week, we are on schedule to receive our single largest Pfizer vaccine shipment to date. And next week, we're expecting an even larger shipment from Pfizer again. Yesterday, I spoke with Noubar Afeyan, chairman of Moderna. He confirmed that, as promised, we are on track to receive 2 million doses of the Moderna vaccine before the end of March. Months ago, we promised a total of 6 million vaccines by the end of Q1, that is, the end of March. That's exactly what we're going to deliver. Following that, the ramp-up phase in April will feature many more millions of doses. We'll all be better off as we see doses coming into Canada, getting into people's arms, helping our parents and grandparents, getting our essential workers vaccinated as we move into the spring. We're going to get there, and we're very much on track to ensure that everyone who wants a vaccine will get vaccinated by the end of September. Comme prévu, c'est donc un total de 6 millions de doses qui vont arriver d'ici la fin mars.
6 million doses, or 4 million doses rather, will arrive by the end of March. There will be an additional amount for the accelerated phase. Everyone will be able to receive a vaccine by the end of September. This morning, I spoke with Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the European Commission, who reiterated once again that the transparency mechanism put in place by the European Union will not affect vaccine shipments to Canada.
Recently, some places across the country, like here in Ottawa, have started to ease public health restrictions. It's encouraging, for sure, but it doesn't mean that our fight against this virus is over. On the contrary, we still have to be careful. We can't be letting our guards down. This weekend, you probably heard that new variants of COVID-19 have now been found in all 10 provinces. Many provinces are also reporting evidence of community transmission of these strains. We're following the situation closely. Nobody wants a third wave, especially not with these new variants that are far more contagious. For my part, I'm going to continue working from home as much as possible, even though when I can, I'll come into the office. Getting that balance right is something we're all going to need to look to. We see various provinces opening up their restrictions, and that's a good thing. But at the same time, we need to be making smart choices about how we keep our contacts down, how we prevent COVID-19 from spreading to our loved ones through our community by being careful. We need to limit our movement as much as possible. We need to avoid gatherings. We need to keep wearing our masks. We need to download the COVID Alert app, which will help you, particularly if we're all going out just a little bit more. Having that app that will alert you to exposures around you will help. And even if someone you love has been vaccinated, we need to be careful. We can still transmit, particularly given these new variants, if we're not careful. That's why we have to remain vigilant, even as it's welcome news that things seem to be loosening just a little bit. Aujourd'hui, je veux aussi parler des mesures qu'on prend pour protéger les Canadiens.
I also want to talk about what's being done to protect Canadians from the scourge of gun violence.
Dans certaines de nos villes,
in some of our cities,
des armes à feu sont à la hausse.
Gun crimes are on the rise. This is unacceptable. No one should be afraid of being a victim of a sniper or a stray bullet. As a parent, I know full well that our greatest fear is receiving a tragic call telling us that the worst has happened. In a country like Canada, being a victim of being in the wrong place at the wrong time should never happen. Not at the park, not at the mosque, not at school, not anywhere else. Last year, to combat gun violence, We banned more than 1,500 assault weapon models as promised. These weapons are tools that have been specifically designed to kill as many people as possible, as quickly as possible, and they have no place in our society. We also promised to introduce legislation that would deliver on the rest of our commitments, and that is exactly what we're doing today.
In 2019, firearms were used in 40% of all homicides in Canada. When it comes to keeping Canadians safe from gun violence, we need more than thoughts and prayers. We need concrete action. In 2019, we passed legislation to keep firearms out of the wrong hands, including by expanding background checks. Last year, we banned over 1,500 models of military-style assault weapons. And today, we're announcing new legislation for stronger measures than ever before to combat gun violence in Canada. Banning 1,500 models of assault-style weapons last year was a critical step, but we also need to continue to fight the illegal gun market. That's why we will increase criminal penalties for gun smuggling and trafficking and enhance the capacity of police and border officials to keep illegal firearms out of the country. At the same time, we will also create new offenses for altering the cartridge magazine of a firearm and introduce tighter restrictions on importing ammunition. Canadians called for these bold steps. We heard you, and we are taking action. To make sure that these assault-style weapons are safely removed from our communities, we've studied a range of options. We looked at what our allies are doing, including New Zealand. We saw what works and what doesn't, all while taking into account the realities here at home. And from this, we've charted a plan of action. We will move forward with the Buyback program in the coming months and complete the prohibition to ensure these weapons cannot be legally used, transferred, transported, bequeathed, or sold. Getting these weapons off our streets and out of the hands of criminals means less violence. And that means safer cities and communities. Every measure we're presenting today in Bill C-21 is important, and they all work together as part of a larger strategy. Because you can't fight gun violence or any violence on just one front. And you can't fight it without addressing its root causes. There
are still far too many victims of spousal and gender-based violence in our country. 8 out of 10 victims of spousal abuse are women. The presence of firearms in the home can put lives at risk. Therefore, laws will be proposed to allow friends and family members who are concerned about a situation to apply to the court to immediately confiscate firearms from violent and at-risk individuals and to suspend their firearms acquisition license. These measures will also help to prevent cases of suicide. In addition, we also need to think about our youth and the reasons why someone may end up on the wrong path. As we announced in the fall economic statement, we will invest $250 million over 5 years to support municipalities and Aboriginal communities. These programs will, among other things, aim to combat the influence and control of criminal gangs in our communities.
As part of today's new legislation, we will also support municipalities to ban handguns through bylaws restricting their possession, storage, and transportation. We're backing up the cities with serious federal and criminal penalties to enforce these bylaws, including jail time for people who violate these municipal rules. Again, these are the strongest measures to fight gun violence our country has ever seen. Minister Blair has worked tirelessly for years on this issue, not only in government, but as police chief of our biggest city. This new legislation will make a real difference when it comes to keeping Canadians safe. We all know we'll be hearing from the well-funded gun lobby, and we all know there will be plenty of politics. But let's not forget what this is about. Saving lives. We're not targeting law-abiding citizens who own guns to go hunting or for sport shooting. The measures we're proposing are concrete and practical, and they have one goal and one goal only: protecting you, your family, and your community. Because the victims are real. The pain of their families is real. I stood alongside mourning families at vigils in Sainte-Foy and on the Danforth. I spoke with Constable Heidi Stevenson's family and the other families after the shooting in Portapique. I remember where I was when I was 17 and heard the news of a massacre at l'École Polytechnique. I've sat down with first responders, doctors, and nurses who see every day the cost of gun violence. In Canada, whether it's at the park, at the mosque, at school, at a sports parade, in a small town, in a big city, or in your own home, no one should ever have to be afraid. No more tragedies. No more wrong place, wrong time. The right place to act is here, and the right time is now. Je suis maintenant content de céder la parole au ministre Blair.
I'm now happy to give the floor to Minister Blair. Bill.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister. Good morning. I'd like to begin by thanking the Prime Minister for his remarks, but also for his unwavering leadership and support on this very important issue. Gun ownership in Canada, in this country, is a privilege and not a right. It's a privilege that's predicated on the strict adherence to our laws, our regulations, and our restrictions. It's a principle that's based on the fact that firearms in Canada are intended for use for hunting and for sports purposes. We do not arm ourselves in this country to protect ourselves from our fellow citizens. We rely on the rule of law, not the end of a gun, for our safety. Earlier this morning, Minister Lametti and I had the honor to present to the House Bill C-21, a bill that, when passed, will significantly strengthen gun control in Canada. And with this bill, we are keeping our promise to Canadians to reduce gun violence by strengthening our laws, prohibiting firearms which were designed only to kill, by placing significant and effective new restrictions on guns that are used by criminals, and by creating a regime to remove firearms from dangerous situations made deadly by the presence of a firearm. On May 1st of last year, our government took the extraordinary and necessary action to prohibit over 1,500 tactical assault-style rifles. These were weapons not designed for hunting or sports shooting activities, but rather for their efficiency as weapons designed to kill. They are combat weapons designed to be used in tactical situations, and tragically, they have been used to kill large numbers of innocent people in mass killings around the world and right here in Canada. The deadly efficiency of these firearms has been demonstrated here in Canada with the murder of 14 women at École Polytechnique, 6 worshippers at a mosque in Quebec, 22 men and women in Nova Scotia. They've been used to kill police officers in Moncton and Fredericton, students and injured students at Dawson College. And we have also seen how easy access to assault rifles has led to horrific mass shootings in Las Vegas, Orlando, Parkland, and Sandy Hook, and in Christchurch, New Zealand. And today, we have introduced strict new legislation to complete the work of the prohibition of these weapons. With the passing of this new bill, we will eliminate all legal use of these firearms and impose such conditions as are necessary to keep Canadians safe. Under previous prohibitions, listed firearms have been grandfathered. This allowed owners not only to retain their prohibited firearms, but in many cases, to continue to shoot them at a range, to sell them to other licensed individuals, to acquire additional prohibited weapons, to transfer their ownership, to transfer and to bequeath them. This is not what our legislation allow. These previous measures allowed for these firearms to be used, to be continued to be traded, and to continue to be sold. Under our legislation, current owners of these weapons will be required to comply with strict new regulations, which will effectively eliminate all legal use of these firearms by private owners. They will not be able to legally discharge these weapons at a range or anywhere else. They cannot be transported, sold, traded, transferred, or bequeathed. And we will also define strict new secure storage requirements. And finally, All persons wishing to retain these firearms will be required to obtain a license to possess them and register all prohibited weapons in their possession. With these measures, it will enable the authorities to know exactly who has such firearms, what they have, and where they are stored. And violating any of these requirements could result in serious criminal charges. We know that the vast majority of Canadians who previously acquired these firearms did so legally, and that they will continue to obey the law. We also know that as these new measures will eliminate all legal use of these weapons, the majority of existing owners will have no reason to retain them. We are creating the appropriate conditions and protections to facilitate a fair, respectful, and safe buyback program for these newly prohibited weapons. We believe that the large majority of the newly prohibited firearms will be voluntarily surrendered for compensation. And for those individuals who elect to retain their weapons, they must know that they will be held fully responsible for their secure storage, their non-use, and that they could in fact face serious criminal consequences for their misuse, or if they end up in the hands of criminals. In developing this approach, I want to acknowledge the assistance and advice of law enforcement leaders across the country for their sound advice in developing an approach which will allow for the safe and efficient removal of these weapons from our society. In this legislation, we have also taken strong action to address all of the ways in which criminals historically have gained access to firearms. There are essentially three ways criminals get guns. They are smuggled, most often from the United States. They are stolen from legal owners or from gun retailers, or they are criminally diverted when someone purchases them legally and then sells them illegally. And therefore, we are strengthening our controls at the border. We are requiring secure storage of restricted weapons in a safe or a vault, and we are giving the police the tools that they need to detect and to prosecute people who divert guns into the hands of the illegal market. Firearm smuggling and trafficking penalties will be increased. We will make sure that the police and the courts have the tools they need to prevent, detect, prosecute, and hold to account those who profit from illegal firearms trafficking. And we have listened to the police and to gun violence advocates across the country to strengthen controls for larger capacity magazines, ammunition, and replica firearms. And finally, we are also taking important action to remove firearms from dangerous situations that can be made more deadly by the presence of a firearm. We will introduce what is sometimes called extreme risk laws or red flag laws. They will empower not just the police, but others who, upon becoming aware of the presence of a firearm in a dangerous situation, can take effective action to have a court order the removal of firearms from that individual or from that dangerous situations. These dangerous situations can include such incidents as domestic and intimate partner violence, where a person may be suicidal or emotionally disturbed, or where there is evidence that a person is advocating hatred and violence against women, a religious minority, or any vulnerable person. I want to be clear. This is not shifting the onus onto the victims of these terrible crimes, but rather broadening the authorities, not just of the police, but to all of us, to take effective action to remove firearms from a dangerous situation. It will also more effectively enable officials to suspend a firearm license where the circumstances indicated it is necessary and appropriate to do so. To support these strong new measures, we are also investing, as the Prime Minister has indicated, significantly in law enforcement and our border services to ensure that they have the resources to interdict the supply of guns onto our streets and to implement the new measures that we are bringing forward. We're working to eliminate the pernicious effect of systemic and structural racism that has led to disparate victimization in racialized and Indigenous communities. And in order to do this, we are investing in our kids and our communities to address the social conditions that give rise to gun violence. And we'll be providing support to the many community-based organizations that are doing extraordinary work to change the social conditions that give rise to gun violence and to support the victims of domestic and intimate partner violence and to protect vulnerable people. I'd like to conclude by acknowledging that the overwhelming majority of firearm owners in this country who use their firearms for hunting and sport purposes are law-abiding. They are responsible in their use of firearms. They purchase them legally. They use them responsibly. They store them securely. They obey all of our laws. They earn the privilege of firearm use and ownership in this country, and we respect them for that. There is nothing in the measures that we are bringing forward intended to interfere or make more difficult the activities of legitimate hunting and sport activities with firearms. But we also recognize that firearms in the wrong hands or in the wrong circumstances can result in tragic outcomes. And therefore, we are taking the steps that are necessary to keep Canadians safe. There's overwhelming evidence that strong gun control leads to a reduction in gun violence in countries where it has been implemented. We are fulfilling our promise and taking the measures that we promised Canadians we would to keep them safe by effecting strong gun control measures in this country and ensuring that where firearms are in the hands of someone with criminal intent or in circumstances that can lead to tragedy, we are creating the tools that are necessary to remove those firearms from that situation and to keep Canadians safe. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much, Bill. I think I'm up next. Good morning. Aujourd'hui, nous vivons un moment historique pour les femmes au Canada.
The Deputy Prime Minister. Today is a historic moment for women in Canada, for femicide prevention in Canada, and for the advancement of a safer society for all Canadians. With Bill C-21, we are delivering on our commitment to remove the most dangerous guns from our streets and our communities. And it's high time that we did. Frankly, we've been waiting for it for a long time. And it's no coincidence that this has happened in the midst of a pandemic, at a time when so many families are isolated in their homes, and reported cases of domestic violence have skyrocketed.
Let me share with you some painful facts. Intimate partner violence accounts for 28% of all police-reported violent crime in Canada. 28%. In 8 out of 10 of these cases, according to Statistics Canada, women are the victims. One woman or girl is killed in Canada every other day on average, according to the Canadian Femicide Observatory for Justice and Accountability. Once each week, here in Canada, a woman is killed by her male partner. Faced with this violence, and given the opportunity to take steps to prevent it, it would be wrong not to do so. And please, let's set aside once and for all the emotive argument that banning assault weapons or assault-style weapons in some way imperils the rural way of life. That is simply not true. I grew up on a farm in northern Alberta. We had guns on our farm, as did our neighbors. If there were bears around, my dad would keep a gun in his pickup. And sometimes he'd hunt prairie chickens on the way home for supper. And you know what? Neither my dad nor any other farmer I knew then, or have known since, owned an assault rifle or an assault-style rifle. That's because those weapons are not for hunting. They aren't for shooting a prairie chicken or for scaring a bear. They're designed for just one purpose: to kill people and to look like they can kill people. Gun violence, all too often aimed at women and girls, is an ugly reality of our society. We have to face it, and we have to do everything in our power to end it. We do that by tightening gun control, as we propose to do with this legislation. In doing so, we will make Canadian women and girls safer. We will make all vulnerable populations, including trans and two-spirited people, racialized Canadians, and Indigenous people in Canada, safer. We will make Canada a safer place to live for all of us. Thank you. Merci.
Now turn it over to Minister Lametti.
Thank you. Merci. Bonjour, hello. Merci de vous joindre à nous aujourd'hui.
Thank you for joining us this morning for this very important announcement on Bill C-21.
I'm joining you from the traditional territory of the Algonquin people. Je suis heureux de me joindre aujourd'hui à mes collègues, le Premier ministre Trudeau,
Minister Lametti still speaking. I'm happy to join you today and to join my colleague, the Honourable Minister of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness, Mr. Bill Blair, the Deputy Prime Minister, and my colleague, Mr. Lightbound.
We know that reducing gun smuggling into Canada is essential to reducing illegal access to firearms. Our proposed legislation includes measures to keep illegal guns out of Canada. This includes increasing the maximum penalties for criminal code offenses of gun smuggling and trafficking from 10 years to 14 years imprisonment. We are also proposing to extend the prohibition on the import, export, or sale of air guns that exactly resemble a conventional regulated firearm, just as lower-powered replica firearms are already prohibited. Les armes à feu de ce type menacent la sécurité publique parce qu'elles ne sont
Weapons
pas
of that type
assujetties à la
are a threat to
réglementation,
public safety
sont
because they're
facilement
not
accessibles et se distinguent mal des armes à
easy
feu
to distinguish
réglementées.
from regulated
Elles peuvent
firearms.
servir
They're
à
easily
commettre
accessible.
l'infraction
They can
et,
be used to
bien
commit an
qu'ils soient moins
offense,
puissants
and
que les
although
armes à
they
feu
are less
traditionnelles,
powerful than
sont
traditional
susceptibles
firearms,
de causer
they
des
are
blessures.
likely
De
to
plus,
cause injury.
comme elles ressemblent
What's
des
more,
vraies
because they
armes à feu,
resemble real
les
firearms
policiers
very
doivent
closely,
les
police
considérer comme
officers
telles.
have to consider them
Nous allons
as
aussi
such.
ajouter une nouvelle infraction
We're also adding a
concernant
new
la
offense
modification de
dealing
chargeur.
with the
En ce moment, la
modification
position
of
d'un
a magazine.
chargeur à
At
surcapacité,
present, an overcapacity cartridge
donc qui permet
magazine,
un tir soutenu
which
sans
enables
avoir
continuous
besoin de
firing
recharge
without
fréquente,
having to
est déjà
reload,
interdite.
is already
Toutefois, le fait de
prohibited.
modifier le
However,
chargeur au-delà
modifying
de la
a
capacité permise par la loi
magazine
n'est
beyond that
actuellement pas
capacity
une infraction, malgré que les deux actions représentent
isn't an
un
offense,
danger
even
pour la
though
sécurité
this
publique.
represents a danger to public safety.
Under this new proposed offense, anyone who alters a cartridge magazine to exceed its lawful capacity could face up to 5 years of imprisonment. Throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, we've seen isolation, declines in mental health, and increased risks of domestic violence, all of which have a disproportionate impact on vulnerable populations. Now, more than ever, we need to do more to ensure that Canadians feel safe. Nous sommes conscients que même si une arme n'est jamais utilisée, sa seule présence
We're fully aware
rend
that even if a
n'importe
gun
quelle
isn't
situation
used, its
plus
very
dangereuse
presence
et plus
makes a
menaçante.
situation more dangerous and
C'est pourquoi
threatening.
la loi présentée
That's why
aujourd'hui
the legislation
prévoit
introduced
d'importantes
today
mesures
includes
contre la violence
significant
entre
measures
partenaires intimes, la
for
violence
violence
fondée sur le
among
genre et
intimate partners,
l'automutilation.
gender-based
En particulier,
violence, and
nous proposons un
self-harm.
mécanisme qui permette à tous
Among
les
other things,
citoyens
we are proposing a
et les
mechanism
agents de
for
la paix
all
de demander une
citizens
ordonnance du
and
tribunal interdisant la
law
possession d'une
enforcement
arme à feu
officers
ou
to
l'accès à une
go
arme
to
à
a
feu
court
à une
to
personne qui présente une menace
request
envers
an
elle-même ou
order
les autres.
banning the
Cet
possession
ajout
of a
au code
firearm.
criminel donnerait plus de
This
pouvoir aux
addition will give
personnes
additional
qui se sentent
power to
menacées
people who
par la
feel
présence
threatened
d'une
by the
arme
presence
dans leur
of a
domicile
firearm in their
ou
home,
par une
or
personne
by a
en
person
particulier ayant accès à une arme.
in particular
In
with
addition to
access
these measures
to a
introduced
firearm.
today, I am pleased to announce that we will be making improvements to the classification framework. This review we are proposing will examine various issues and close gaps in the law. This includes whether to update the current list of prohibited firearms by make and model, or whether such firearms should be prohibited by amending the definition of prohibited firearm in the criminal code to include assault-style firearms. Such a review is long overdue. The last one was conducted over 2 decades ago. The classification review would only begin once the proposed legislation is passed by Parliament. Our government has heard the calls for action. We are following through on our commitment to address serious gun violence. Today's proposed reform is another step towards strengthening Canada's gun control framework as we work together to keep our homes, our communities, and our country safe. Thank you. Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Lametti. P.S. Lightbound. Oui, bonjour à tous et merci de vous joindre à nous, Monsieur le Premier
Mr.
ministre, chers
Lightbound,
collègues.
good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. We recently celebrated the anniversary of the shooting at the mosque in Quebec City, which there was also the shooting in Nova Scotia. Then we had Moncton, Toronto, Concordia, and in December, we commemorate the Polytechnique in Montreal. These are tragedies. Each year, there are shootings that don't make the news because they occur in homes. In 2018, more than several thousand victims of violence were reported. There are street gangs. Gangs are using firearms to protect their territory and to settle their scores. And there is no doubt that street violence is a problem across the country. It's something that we need to continue to fight and that we will continue to try to stem. We have to bear in mind as well that gun violence can happen anywhere at any time, in very different contexts. We have to deal with it on all fronts. And that's what we're doing, because fighting gun violence is and must be a priority for our government. Last May, we banned 1,500 assault-style weapons, which put an end to their spread. This was a first step to protecting Canadians. The majority of firearms owners in Canada are responsible, law-abiding citizens. Powerful and dangerous assault-style weapons, however, were not designed for recreational activities such as hunting. They were designed to be used on a battlefield in the time of war, and they have no place in our society. Today, we're announcing the next step in our strategy to fight gun violence. Earlier today, Minister Blair tabled legislation in the House to fight gun violence and to respect our commitments with respect to firearms control in Canada. Bill C-21 proposes, among other things, several modifications to the criminal code. First of all, the government seeks to deal with suicide and domestic violence by putting in place red flag laws, which will enable firearms owners and law enforcement agencies to go to a court for an order. This will make it possible to immediately confiscate firearms from people who may represent a danger to themselves, for their loved ones, or for others. We're also proposing changes to the Firearms Act to create a suspension act. Anyone with concerns about the eligibility of a person for a firearm certificate will be able to report that. A permit could be suspended for 30 days if there are grounds to believe that someone is displaying behavior that would make it not possible to use. In order to deal with trafficking and smuggling, we are also putting forth a change to increase the maximum fine from 10 to 14 years. The bill will also change the Firearms Act to ensure that restrictions are complied with for storage and transportation of firearms in places adopting these municipal regulations. This will be a requirement for a license, and non-compliance can lead to the revocation of the permit. This is a scourge in many municipalities, and it is important to impose restrictions. Finally, this bill proposes offering firearm owners an opportunity to store firearms. This means that someone could agree and decide to store firearms at home, but will not be allowed to bequeath them, transfer them, or sell them. Over time, the number of prohibited firearms will decrease considerably and eventually be eliminated from Canadian society. For people who wanted to dispose of their firearm, the government will offer a buyback program, as mentioned mentioned earlier. In summary, these are the changes being proposed. Changes that will ensure that firearms don't end up in the wrong hands. This is in addition to investments in our communities in prevention through work in conjunction with the provinces and to territories to increase capacity for our federal agencies and police forces, as well as the border services officers. Several $1 million will go to dealing with the gangs at the border. These are additional investments. We know that there are no universal solutions to dealing with gun violence. As I said at the outset, that this violence has several faces and we need to attack it on all fronts. This is the commitment we made to Canadians and it's exactly what we're doing. A safer society is what we are seeking to achieve. Thank you very much.
Thank you, PS Lightbound. We'll now turn to media on the phone first. One question, one follow-up. Operator.
Thank you. Merci. Première question, Raymond Fillon.
Our first question is from Raymond Fillon from TVA. Question. Good morning, Prime Minister. What will the buyback program cost? Many people think that a buyback program, an optional one like you're proposing, doesn't go far enough. Why not a mandatory one? Answer, the Prime Minister. Ray, that's a really good question. We've looked at all kinds of examples across the world, including New Zealand. We've looked at how we can adapt the various programs the best way to the Canadian reality, and we've determined that what we are proposing is the best, most effective option to protect Canadians. For more details, I'm very happy to turn to Minister Blair, including with respect to potential costs. Bill?
Before I turn to Minister Blair, let me just say that we looked very carefully at buyback programs around the world, including in New Zealand. We reflected carefully on what the right model would be given the Canadian circumstances, and we went forward with the model that we think will be the most effective in keeping Canadians safe from gun violence. On further details, I'm happy to turn to Minister Blair, who's been working on this for many decades. Bill.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister. I want to acknowledge as well the very strong advocacy from a number of different community groups who represent the tragic victims of gun violence. And they are very concerned about the presence of these firearms in our society, as are we. And I want to explain to them that, first of all, we look very, very carefully, as the Prime Minister's indicated, at the experience in other jurisdictions, notably most recently in New Zealand, but also buybacks that have been undertaken in other jurisdictions, such as Australia. In those circumstances, what we found is that very often, if authorities and governments did not have adequate and comprehensive, fulsome information about actually who has these weapons, what weapons are possessed out there, and where they are located, it limits the effectiveness of a buyback program. And so through Bill C-21, we are going to require that people who are in possession of these weapons, who, by the way, and I would point out, acquired them legally when it was lawful to do so. And since we have prohibited them, we want to make sure that we treat with those individuals who acquired them legally, respectfully and fairly. But under this legislation, first of all, we will require them to require a license and to provide information on what firearms, in fact, they possess and where they are located. We are also introducing strong new measures that virtually eliminate all legal use of these weapons, which will create a very strong incentive for people to voluntarily surrender them for compensation. And as well, we have, in consultation with law enforcement, we have consulted with them on how a compulsory buyback might be affected. And they have strongly indicated that, first of all, they would need information as to where these weapons were located and who had them. They would also have to form reasonable probable grounds in order to get search warrants to do searches and seizures. And so based on our experience and our analysis of other jurisdictions, and as well in consultation with law enforcement in the safest way to effect our purpose of removing as many of these weapons from our society as possible, we have proposed to introduce through this legislation strong incentives for the surrender and compensation of these weapons, eliminating all elements of legal use. They can't be shot, they can't be traded, they can't be transported, they can't be sold, and they can't be bequeathed to the overwhelming majority of Canadians who originally acquired these weapons lawfully. They did so that they could use them as firearms. We have eliminated that use through this legislation, and therefore the vast majority of them are fully anticipated and have indicated their intention to surrender those weapons for compensation. And for those who may choose to retain them, we have very strong measures in place to ensure that they will never be used legally as a firearm, that they will always be stored securely. And if the circumstances of their possession should ever provide evidence of a risk, either in an intimate partner violence or domestic violence situation, or where a person may be suicidal or emotionally disturbed, or where the individual may be involved in advocating hate and violence against a religious minority or any other vulnerable purpose, we're providing and developing the tools that are necessary to remove all firearms from that dangerous situation.
Minister Ray?
Yeah, I didn't get an answer on the cost of the buyback program. If you could provide one, that'd be great. Et j'aimerais aussi entendre le Premier ministre sur la question des vaccins. Est-ce que votre gouvernement
Mr. Fillon still speaking. What about the vaccines? Does your government regret not having funded the efforts by the Canadian and the production of a Canadian vaccine which was being developed in Canada? Answer, the Prime Minister. Purchasing vaccines is based on expert advice from our vaccine panel. These experts had the capability and the experience to analyze the various proposals put forward and to choose the ones with the greatest potential for Canadians. Clearly, choices had to be made. We ended up with one of the best portfolios of vaccines across the world, with more doses per capita than any other country. We have made investments as well in Canadian productions because we know that providing or ensuring vaccine availability domestically and obtaining it internationally are both important.
Operator.
Thank you. Merci. Next question, Christy Kirkup, The Globe and Mail. Line open.
Hello, good morning. Prime Minister, you mentioned learning lessons from New Zealand, but there is a mandatory buyback program in that country. So why is your government backing away from the mandatory buyback pledge here?
We have, since last spring, banned assault-style weapons in this country. 1,500 different models that can now no longer be used, shot in one's backyard, transported, sold, bequeathed, transferred. Since last spring, these assault-style weapons cannot be used in Canada. That was a significant step forward. We are now ensuring that there is a buyback program so that Canadians who lawfully purchase these weapons are treated fairly and respectfully, and now that they are next to useless as weapons, are able to obtain fair compensation for that. But as Minister Blair explained, we also need to ensure that anyone who chooses to keep those weapons needs to store them securely, needs to inform us fully about all the details on those weapons and demonstrate secure storage for it while not using it. These are the things that we have determined is the best path forward to keep Canadians safe, to get as many of these weapons out of circulation in this country as possible, and to ensure people are safe moving forward. But again, I'm happy to turn to Minister Blair for further elucidation of this.
Yeah, thanks, Prime Minister. And Christy, when the New Zealand government prohibited assault rifles in their country, they estimated that there may be as many as 150,000 of them in the country. But like us, they did not have a registry of all of those weapons. And so it was a best guess estimate of how many were out there. They did have a compulsory buyback, and they've retrieved about 55,000 weapons, which leaves a great uncertainty, honestly, in their country as to what other weapons may be out there that were not surrendered, notwithstanding a compulsory program. And so we've learned from that and applied the lessons that they experienced. And so we're putting legislation in place that will, first of all, require everyone who is in lawful possession of these weapons in Canada today to obtain a license and to provide information on what weapons they possess, where they're located. And that information will give us very good insight, not only as to the scope of the undertaking of the buyback, but also it'll provide us with information as to where these guns are. And that was something that New Zealand unfortunately did not have. I think they did an extraordinary job, but that lack of that information limited their success. We are also, through this legislation, creating something that they also did not do, and that is to render these weapons legally unusable. They cannot be used as a firearm. They can't be sold, bought, traded, or transported. And through those measures, we have rendered basically these weapons useless as firearms. They cannot be used legally as firearms, which will create a very strong incentive for those individuals that purchase them legally to use as firearms. Note that now that they no longer can, to surrender them for fair compensation. And as well, we also believe it is in the Canadians' interest to facilitate that buyback in a way which is fair and respectful and safe. And that's why we've consulted very closely with law enforcement in this country to make sure that it can be done in that way. I believe that this is overwhelmingly the most effective way to remove those firearms from our society, and for the very few that people may choose to retain, to ensure that there is a strong legislative framework that prohibits their legal use and creates real consequences, criminal consequences for people who misuse them. If anyone chose to take that firearm and discharge it at a range, then that would be illegal use of a prohibited weapon and would result in a criminal charge.
Répondre en français. Depuis le printemps passé,
The Prime Minister answering. Since last spring, it has been illegal to buy, transfer, sell, or bequeath assault-style weapons in our country. That was an extremely important step. Now, with this program, we are adding the buyback program to purchase these firearms back from people who purchase them legally. For those who choose to keep these firearms that they can no longer use legally, they will have to register them and prove, in fact, that they are storing them extremely safely. If ever those conditions are violated, there will be severe conditions, strict conditions. Based on everything we've learned across the world, we find that this is the best way of moving forward and the best way of protecting Canadians from gun violence.
Follow-up, Christy.
And just on the matter of municipalities being able to bring in handgun bans, does this not set up the possibility of a patchwork where gun laws differ from municipality to municipality? And if so, how is that at all desirable?
The laws on storage of firearms are uniform across the country. Our expectations on being handled safely and securely by law-abiding gun owners are secure across the country, but we recognize that there are many municipalities who have expressed a desire to move forward with further restrictions, including banning the possession, transportation, or use of firearms, particularly handguns, within their city limits. And we are now moving forward to enable those bylaws passed by cities to have federal and criminal consequences for anyone who violates them. It is the promise we made that we would allow cities to ban handguns, and that's exactly what we're doing. Again, happy to turn to Bill.
Thanks, Prime Minister. It's important to note, first of all, that handguns are already highly restricted weapons in this country. We have strict licensing requirements and necessary and appropriate restrictions on their use because of their concealability and greater danger, and we know that they represent a significant risk, and that's why we restrict them. With Bill C-21, first of all, we're introducing additional restrictions on those firearms with respect to people who criminally divert them into the hands of criminals. And very importantly, we're introducing very strong new measures on secure storage, because we know many of these guns are being stolen from legal gun owners and from gun retailers across the country and then used in tragedies everywhere. But we are also working with municipalities, and in our conversation with municipalities, they have clearly indicated a strong desire to impose additional restrictions on those firearms appropriate to their unique circumstances and their concerns about gun violence. And you know, if we just look at the most recent past, where a 15-year-old young woman was shot and killed in Montreal, a 14-year-old girl was shot in Toronto. The gun violence that's taking place, not just in urban centers, but in communities across this country, is deeply concerning to all of us. And we're making sure that we're going to support municipalities in imposing additional and appropriate restrictions up to and including, you know, bans on the possession, the storage, and the use of firearms within their jurisdictions. We believe that the measures that we put in place for the whole country are strong and rigorous, but we acknowledge and respect the concerns that municipalities have expressed to us about the need for additional restrictions in their communities. And we're going to facilitate that through this legislation so that their regulations and restrictions will also be a requisite compliance for people who have licenses for restricted weapons, that they'll also have to comply with all of the restrictions imposed by the municipalities in which they reside.
Merci. Prochaine question. Operator.
Thank you. Merci. Prochaine question. Lina Dib, La Presse canadienne.
Lina Dib, La Presse canadienne. Next question. Ms. Adib speaking. Good morning, Prime Minister. Minister Blair just talked about the death of the young girl in Montreal. Mayor Laplante talked about the tragedy, and she said she doesn't want a municipal handgun ban. She wants that to come from the federal government. Can you tell her how this bill will help the Mayor of Montreal to resolve her problem? Answer from the Prime Minister. During the last campaign, we promised cities we would ban handguns, and this is exactly what we're doing here. We acknowledge that realities are different across the country, but all cities and municipalities that want to move forward with additional restrictions beyond the very strong restrictions we're already placing on handguns across the country will be able to do so with criminal consequences for those who do not comply with the municipal regulations. I also want to underscore the importance of other measures that we have put in place to combat trafficking in handguns. We have made conditions, consequences rather harsher and more strict for handgun owners who transfer them or sell them subsequently to gangs. There is a great deal of work that needs to be done with all of our partners in the municipalities across the country. Follow-up question, Lina Adib. With respect to the buyback program, Minister Blair has said that the problem in New Zealand was that they didn't know where the firearms were. You're saying that with this bill, a permit will need to be held, we'll know where they are. Does that mean that this is a first step, that once you've located them, that the buyback program could become mandatory and that you could gather them up, or you're going to simply respect these owners who've purchased them? And for the third time, we'd like to know what the buyback program will cost. Answer, the Prime Minister. These firearms that people purchased legally over the years are now completely useless. They cannot use them legally, they can't sell them, they can't transport them, they can't fire them in their yards. They can't go to other facilities for shooting to shoot them. They are not usable. Now, if there are some collectioners who nonetheless want to keep them, they will have to register them and show the measures that they are taking to ensure that they are safely stored and cannot be stolen, borrowed, or used in any way. In the years to come, because these weapons can't be bequeathed to a subsequent generation, in several decades then, these firearms will be returned, but people who did purchase them legally, they will ultimately realize that there's no point in keeping them, and we're offering them a buyback. And for that, to comment further on that, I'll give the floor to Minister Blair.
Thank you again, Prime Minister. Yeah, just to be clear, unfortunately, we estimate that there may be between 150 and 200,000 of these assault-style rifles currently owned legally in Canada. One of the reasons we have such a range in that estimation is a number of these weapons were not previously restricted. And as unrestricted weapons, we actually had no information and have no information about who owns them and where they're located, or even what makes and models are out there. And so I think it's very important that we take very effective measures to bring that situation, which is a potentially dangerous one, under control. And we do that by requiring people who are in lawful possession of these weapons to properly license them and to register the information so that the authorities know where these guns are. I also believe that through the effective legal measures that we're implementing in Bill C-21, as the Prime Minister has indicated, we're eliminating all legal use of these firearms. It's important to recognize that the Canadians who purchased these weapons prior to the prohibition did so legally. They did it according to the law. And they are overwhelmingly, in my experience, law-abiding, responsible firearm owners. Now that we've changed the law with respect to those weapons, and we are imposing significant new restrictions that render them virtually unusable as a firearm, I think we're working towards is creating a path to legality and fairness for those Canadians who purchased those weapons legally, now that we have rendered them unusable as firearms, for them to surrender them and to be compensated fairly. With respect to the compensation cost, we intend that, first of all, that the buyback program and its administration be done in a fair and responsible way. And that's fiscally responsible as well. It needs to be fair, and so we will offer and we'll have independent assessment on the value of the weapons that surrendered for compensation. But we also want to make sure the administration is effective as well. We are trying to resolve the existence of these firearms in our country in a fair, responsible, and safe way. We believe that this is the best way to effect that. I also believe that the overwhelming majority of Canadians who bought these guns to use as firearms, now that they can no longer be legally used for firearms, they will be strongly incentivized to surrender them for compensation. And for those few who may choose as collectors to retain them, they will have to understand that they will have significant responsibility for the secure storage and non-use of those weapons, and failing to do so can result in criminal prosecution.
CTV News. Prime Minister, in 2006 at Dawson College in your hometown, there was a mass shooting, and a young woman named Anastasia D'Souza was killed with a legally owned restricted class rifle that you have now reclassified as prohibited. But there's nothing in your bill that would prevent that shooting other than making it illegal for the gunman to use it, as you say, in his backyard or at a shooting range. What would you say to the students who were terrorized at Dawson College about this piece of legislation you brought today and how it would have made them safer?
I actually suggest that the red flag laws that we are bringing in would make it easier for family members or acquaintances of the shooter in question to have reported the pattern of troubling behavior that had been surrounding them. I'm not going to pronounce too much on the individual case, but certainly the moves we're making today, not just around banning assault-style weapons, which the shooter in question would no longer be able to legally purchase the weapon that he legally purchased back then. That, moving forward, keeps us all safer. Secondarily, the red flag laws that red and yellow flag laws we're bringing in would allow people to highlight when someone is engaged in troublesome behaviors, that perhaps their possession and acquisition license should be suspended, perhaps their weapons should be withdrawn. These are the kinds of things that we're moving forward to keep people safe. Obviously, I remember well the tragedy at Dawson College and how we were all shaken by it, along with so many other tragedies. The measures we're putting forward today will ensure that those events are much less likely in the future.
Bonjour, M. Trudeau, Louis Blouin de Radio-Canada. Ce qui dérange les groupes anti-armes, c'est que ces
Question from the
armes-là
room.
vont rester dans les maisons.
What bothers people is that these firearms will be kept in the house. In New Zealand, they took out hundreds of thousands of firearms out of circulation. Are you afraid it's going to cost too much? Are you afraid that it's going to be something that's not popular?
I find it hard to believe that you don't have an estimation about how much this could cost. So please, again, how much do you think, even if it's a ballpark, how much could this cost? Please, thank you.
Merci, Louis. Pour la première partie de la
Answer the Prime Minister speaking. Well, thank you, Louis. For the first part of your question, we know that the vast majority of people who purchased these firearms legally, firearms that are now illegal, assault-style weapons, will realize that they can't use them as a firearm, they can't use them, they can't transfer them, they can't sell them. They will willingly relinquish them with compensation. For people who do want to keep them, we will keep a record of all people who will want to keep them legally. That will result in a massive decrease in the number of assault-style weapons across the country, and it's an important way of keeping Canadians safe into the future. I'll now go to Bill.
And thank you very much, Prime Minister. Prime Minister, as you said, what I would tell the students of Dawson College is that the weapon that was used in that terrible day to kill one of their fellow students and injure 8 others was no longer available in Canada. That effective at May 1st of last year, we prohibited that firearm and nearly 1,500 other weapons exactly like it that were designed to efficiently shoot and kill people. And so that weapon is no longer legally available for sale. You know, as we see in other jurisdictions, and most notably just to the south of us, where they have a much different approach to firearms. We have seen an incredible proliferation of these types of weapons throughout their society. In Canada, we've ended that. We've ended that with the prohibition on these assault weapons, and we are frankly nailing the coffin shut with the new regulations we're bringing forward in C21. That through legislation we are rendering all of those weapons illegal for use in any way in Canada, and I think that's the assurance that I would provide to those members, and so that we are also taking steps to identify all of those weapons that currently are owned in Canada and in the possession of Canadians, to identify what those weapons are, where they're located, and who's in possession of them. And we are taking the appropriate actions to strongly incentivize their surrender and compensation. And finally, we're taking action to ensure that for those weapons that are not surrendered, that they can never be legally used and they'll be appropriately stored. With respect to your question on the buyback, it really depends. And as I've said, we don't have a precise calculation of how many of these weapons are currently owned in Canada. And if we take the estimate, for example, of 150 to 200,000 of these weapons that would be surrendered and for which compensation would be paid on an average price, and we've done some calculation on this, of approximately $1,300 per firearm, The estimate is somewhere between $300 and $400 million, but it really depends on knowing exactly how many of these firearms and what is currently possessed in Canada. The process of determining through a fair and objective assessment as to their fair market value, and ensuring that the administration of that program is done in the most efficient, safe, and effective means possible. But we are, I think, taking the appropriate measures to make a buyback program effective, to remove the overwhelming majority of these weapons from our society. And by the actions we took last May and the actions we are now reinforcing through this legislation today, we have ensured that these weapons will never be legally used in Canada. And I believe the program that we have proposed is the most effective, safe, and responsible way to remove the vast majority of them from our society.
Hello, Prime Minister. I'm Mike Blanchfield, Canadian Press. I want to circle back to the non-optional buyback idea. I mean, experts say that buyback programs are more likely to fail than compulsory ones. So why have an optional one? And you referenced earlier the blowback that you expect from the gun lobby. Are you making a political calculation here, as well as another sort of calculation by taking this approach, given that expert opinion seems to suggest that a mandatory buyback might be the best course of action?
I will turn to Bill Blair for the expert opinions and analysis that has been done on the best way to keep Canadians safe from assault-style weapons, which we banned last March. But on the politics of it, obviously, there are political elements in this. But the core of why we are doing this, the core of why Canadians want this done, is to keep our communities safe. In Canada, people can use guns for hunting and for sport shooting, not for personal protection. And there is no need for military-style assault weapons anywhere in this country. That's why we moved forward with a ban on those weapons last year. That's why we're moving forward with what we have determined as being the best way to keep Canadians safe from these weapons going forward. Bill.
Yeah, thanks, Prime Minister. I appreciate the opportunity. It's a very useful question because it gives me an opportunity to clarify what the buyback program that we are proposing. You know, when I was the police chief in Toronto, we used to run amnesties where we would tell people if they wanted to surrender their firearms voluntarily, we would provide compensation. One year we had a program called Pixels for Pistols, where we had made arrangements to give people a camera in lieu of the gun. Those are voluntary programs, and it's based on people who no longer, they choose, they have no longer any use for that particular firearm, so they surrender it. That's what a pure voluntary program is. That is not at all what we are proposing. And so when the experts, and I read the opinion of one on the newspaper, he was talking about comparing a compulsory buyback where there would be legislation requiring people to surrender their weapons versus the type of voluntary amnesty that we've run in municipalities and provinces across the country. What we are proposing is very different than that voluntary program. What we are proposing, first of all, is through strict, strong legislation to identify all of these weapons in our society. Other jurisdictions, such as New Zealand and Australia, did not do that. And therefore, although I think they did some extraordinary work, they can't with confidence say that they got even the majority of the weapons in their country. Their estimates of what they actually retrieved versus what they believe were present in their country are far apart. And so we want to close that gap. We want to close that gap with knowledge and data. And so we're implementing strong legislation that requires the people who currently own these guns to acquire a license and to provide data and information to register them all. So we'll know exactly where they are, we'll know what there is, and we know who's got them. And as well, we're also implementing very strong legislation that changes the nature of those firearms. They are no longer legally can be used in this country. And they can't be sold, they can't be transferred, they can't be traded. They can't be bequeathed to the next generation. They cannot be discharged. You can't take them hunting, can't take them to a range, can't even drive around with them. They've got to be locked up in a safe in your home. And as a result of all of those regulations and restrictions that we are putting in place with respect to those guns, we have rendered them virtually legally useless in this country. And we are offering a program of fair compensation to those people who bought them legally We've changed their legal status in this country to prohibit it. We've ended the proliferation of these weapons in our country. And this is, in my opinion, the most effective and responsible way to, first of all, identify where all these weapons are and to take the steps necessary to remove them from our society. And it is the most comprehensive and effective way. And as I said, I've also consulted with justice and law enforcement officials about how a compulsory program might be affected, requiring the police, for example, to get search warrants. And they would need reasonable and probable grounds to go in and look for those guns. I'm not sure where they'd get those reasonable and probable grounds because we don't have that information about where those guns are currently. We will, as a result of the new regulations and restrictions that we are putting in place in Bill C-21. And so we are going to create a much safer situation for Canadians and affect a far more efficient and effective buyback regime to get those weapons out of our society than if we simply said, you know, we're going to compel people because we don't know who's got them and how we might therefore legally compel them would remain a significant challenge. I think the way that we are proposing to do it is the right way. And it's not simply saying, if you'd like to drop the thing off, we'll give you some money. We have changed the nature of the weapon and we have rendered it virtually useless as a firearm through the law. And as a consequence, we believe the vast majority of rational firearm owners will choose to surrender them, be compensated, and they may go and acquire other firearms which are not prohibited and are therefore far less dangerous. If I may, Prime Minister, before the next question, I'd also like to be very clear. This is about public safety. You know, I appreciate that there are, you know, political interests and you know, I'm sure we'll hear blowback from the gun lobby. This is about keeping Canadians safe. This is an acknowledgement that those weapons were designed to kill people and have been used to kill people in this country. That's why we prohibited them. It's why we are working hard to ensure that we have all of those weapons under legislative control, that they can't be used as firearms. And why we are taking the steps that I believe will be the most effective to remove those firearms from our society. And it really is about keeping Canadians safe. That has been our overriding priority from the outset, and we'll continue to work towards that end.
Régulièrement, dans
the Prime Minister,
les médias,
regularly
un attentat ou une
in the
attaque terrible
in the
aux
media
États-Unis ou
following
ailleurs,
an attack, we hear people say, well, this isn't a time to talk about politics. It's not their time to talk about firearm control. It's a time to be there for families and to reflect on how we can better support each other. It's also a time to react. We're a government that moves forward to protect Canadians. There will be political debates surrounding it, but what's important to bear in mind is that Canadians want to be protected from firearm violence. They want to see fewer innocent people killed, less domestic violence involving a firearm. We have a responsibility, all of us, to protect each other. And of course, there will be political debates. It's important for that to happen. But we have to remember that at each step along the way, our objective is to protect Canadians, to keep communities safe, and that is exactly what we're doing.
Prime Minister Tom Perry, CBC. My question is about China. Conservative leader Aaron O'Toole said this morning that China's treatment of its Uyghur minority is a genocide. He says that Canada should be pushing for Beijing to lose the Olympic Games. What more evidence does your government need to see before it concludes whether or not a genocide is occurring in China? And given we're even discussing the possibility of a genocide, is Beijing an appropriate venue for the Olympics?
First of all, on determinations of genocide, the principles of international law and the international community in general, I think rightly, takes very, very seriously the label of genocide and needs to ensure that when it is used, it is clearly and properly justified and demonstrated so as not to weaken the application of genocide in situations in the past. And that's why it's a word that is extremely loaded and is certainly something that we should be looking at. in the case of the Uyghurs. And I know the international community is looking very carefully at that, and we are certainly among them, and we will not hesitate from being part of the determinations around these sorts of things. We have been consistent in our concerns and our condemnation of human rights violations around the world, including the situations in Hong Kong and in Xinjiang and elsewhere. We will continue to work with the international community and move forward on making the right determinations based on facts and evidence as appropriate. In regards to the Olympics, we continue to be very, very vocal in standing up for human rights around the world and calling out human rights abuses, as I have personally in the past directly with Chinese leadership, among many others. We know that the International Olympic Committee, the Canadian Olympic Committee, the Canadian Paralympic Committee, and others are looking very closely at this issue, and we will certainly continue to follow carefully. D'abord, il faut savoir que ce mot
The Prime Minister speaking. First of
est un
all,
mot extrêmement
the word
important et
genocide
chargé,
is
dans
a very
la
important
communauté
term. It's a
internationale,
loaded
dans
term in the
la
international
loi
community,
internationale.
in international law
Il
as
faut
well.
s'assurer,
We have
que
to
quand on
ensure,
l'applique, ce soit
when using
justifié,
it, that it's justified
et que ce soit la réalité,
and that it is the reality.
parce qu'on ne voudrait pas
Because
atténuer ou
we wouldn't
minimiser
want
la
to
réalité des
attenuate
génocides
or
qui
minimize
ont été vus, constatés,
genocide
déclarés dans le passé.
that has
Dans
been
l'histoire
declared
de l'humanité.
genocide in the
Donc,
past
c'est un mot avec
in the
lequel
course
il
of
faut
humanity.
prendre un
So it's
certain niveau d'attention et de,
a word we
de
must use
rigueur
cautiously,
quand on va l'appliquer.
with rigor.
Mais je peux vous rassurer
I
que le
can
Canada
assure
prend
you
très au sérieux
that
ces
Canada
allégations
takes
et
the
qu'on
allegations
travaille
very
avec nos
seriously.
partenaires et avec la communauté
We are working with our
internationale,
partners and the
pour faire une
international community
détermination,
to make a
si, ça
determination
s'applique effectivement,
if
comme
it
il y a
applies.
plusieurs de personnes et d'institutions crédibles qui suggèrent que
As
ça
several
s'appliquerait
credible institutions
à
are
la situation des
suggesting,
Ouïghours
it does
dans
apply to the
l'ouest de la
Uyghurs
Chine.
in China.
Par rapport aux Olympiques,
With respect to the
d'abord,
Olympics,
nous allons toujours souligner nos préoccupations
we
par
will
rapport aux
always
droits humains.
highlight
Nous allons
our
toujours
concerns for human
souligner, comme
rights,
je l'ai fait directement, personnellement,
as I did
aux
directly
dirigeants de la
and
Chine, dans les rencontres que
personally
j'ai eues au fil
in
des
the
années.
meetings that I've had
Nos
with Chinese
préoccupations avec la
authorities in the
situation
past. We
à
will
Hong Kong, avec la
talk
situation
about the
en
situation
Xinjiang.
in Hong Kong,
Nous reconnaissons
Xinjiang.
que c'est une conversation importante
We
à
recognize that
avoir,
this is an important conversation to have
avec l'approche des Jeux olympiques à Beijing.
with the
Mais,
approach of the
nous
Olympics
savons
in
aussi
Beijing.
que la communauté olympique internationale,
We
la
also
communauté
know
olympique
that the
canadienne,
International
les
Olympic
comités
Community,
paralympiques sont en train de
committee
regarder
rather,
attentivement,
as well as the Canadian Olympic
cette
Committee,
situation,
are examining
de
the
réfléchir à leur
situation
position,
and reflecting
et
on
nous
their
allons bien
positions.
sûr suivre attentivement
Of
leur
course, we
réflexion.
will monitor that closely.
Reluctant to use the phrase genocide because of China's continued detention of the two Michaels?
I think the primary concern we have as a government that has always been responsible about using this extremely loaded term is not applying it to things that don't meet the very clear internationally recognized criteria around genocide. There is no question that there have been tremendous human rights abuses reported coming out of Xinjiang. And we are extremely concerned of that and have highlighted our concerns many times. But when it comes to the application of the very specific word genocide, we simply need to ensure that all the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed in the processes before a determination like that is made. We recognize that there are different organizations and even countries that have made that declaration, and the international community and Canada are leaning in carefully to make sure that we can make the right declaration moving forward.
Hélène Buzetti. Bonjour, Monsieur Trudeau. J'aimerais juste revenir à la question
Hélène
des armes de
Buzetti.
poing. Tout à l'heure,
I'd
quand
like
on
to
vous a
come back to
demandé
a
pourquoi
question
laisser ça entre
put
les mains des
earlier
villes, vous nous avez dit leur
about
réalité peut
municipalities. You said
varier
that
d'une ville à l'autre.
the
Alors, pouvez-vous nous
reality
dire à
can
quelle
vary from one
réalité
place to the next.
vous
What reality
pensiez
are
qui
you
pourrait
thinking
amener
about
légitimement
that could
une ville à ne pas vouloir interdire des armes
mean
de poing?
that municipalities won't
spécifiquement sur
ban
le plan
firearms?
constitutionnel
And with
aussi, on
respect to
savait
the
que certaines
constitutional
provinces voulaient
component, we know
peut-être
that some
bloquer les
provinces
villes. Qu'est-ce qu'il y a dans votre
didn't
projet
want
de loi que
to
je n'ai pas qui
block cities.
empêcherait ça? Merci.
Could you comment on that?
Tout d'abord, nous avons des
Answer from the Prime
restrictions,
Minister. First of all,
extrêmement
we
sévères,
have very
contre
strict
les armes de poing à
restrictions
travers le
on
pays.
handguns across the
Nous
country.
avançons avec plus de restrictions
We
au
are
niveau,
putting forth
de
more restrictions
comment les gens les gardent de façon
with the way that
sécuritaire,
people store them
comment les
safely,
gens les protègent,
how people
les conséquences si quelqu'un
protect
va
them,
vendre
consequences
cette arme de poing,
if
à
they're
qui ils peuvent le
sold,
vendre,
to
et
whom
s'ils
they
sont en train tout
are
simplement
authorized to
d'en
sell,
acheter pour ensuite les vendre
if they're simply
à
buying
des
one
criminels.
to
On
sell
a
it
amené à l'échelle
after
du
the
pays,
fact
on est en
to
train
a
d'amener à
criminal.
l'échelle du pays des mesures
We
qui
have
vont
measures across the
resserrer
country
les
that will
restrictions,
tighten up
et les limites
restrictions
sur
and
l'achat
limits surrounding the purchase
l'utilisation des
and
armes de poing.
use of handguns.
On sait qu'il y a beaucoup de Canadiens
We
qui sont
know
propriétaires
that
d'armes
many
de poing
Canadians
pour,
own
pour le
handguns
sport.
for sports
Ils
and
sont
recreational
des
purposes.
propriétaires responsables
They are
qui
responsible
suivent les lois
handgun
de façon,
owners who follow the
rigoureuse
rules
et
rigorously.
exemplaire. Et on n'est pas intéressé à punir
We're not
ces
interested in
gens-là à
punishing
travers le
those
pays,
people
mais
across
nous
the country.
reconnaissons que il y a
We
des villes,
recognize
dont Toronto,
that there are
Montréal et
cities
d'autres,
like
qui
Toronto
reconnaissent
and Montreal, for
un
example,
désir d'aller plus loin avec
that
des
want to
restrictions
take a
encore
step
plus
farther
sévères.
with
Et
stricter
donc,
restrictions.
on a maintenant
And
on est en train d'avancer des mesures
so
qui
we
vont
are putting
permettre à ces
forth
villes
measures to enable
de
those
limiter
cities
ou de bannir des
to
armes de
limit
poing
or ban
de
handguns
leur zone municipale.
from their
Et
municipal
qu'il y aurait
areas.
des conséquences
There would
fédérales et
also be
criminelles
federal
qui pourraient
criminal
s'appliquer à
consequences that
quiconque,
could
n'obéirait
apply
pas
to
à
people who
cette
do
loi-là.
not
Mais je
respect
suis content
those
de
measures.
passer la parole
I'm
au
happy now
ministre Blair
to
pour plus de
allow
détails
Minister
sur
Blair to
les
provide
mesures,
additional
qu'on offre
details
aux
on the measures that are being offered to
Bill.
municipalities. Go ahead, Bill.
Thank you, Prime Minister. And in preparation of this legislation, we've done a very broad consultation with Canadians right across the country, and we recognize that there are very different circumstances in different places. And for example, I'm from the city of Toronto, work very closely with the mayor there and with law enforcement in large municipalities across the country dealing with the scourge of gun violence, and particularly the vast majority of shootings in those places are handguns, and there's a deep concern. It's one of the reasons we bring forward strict new measures to eliminate all the ways in which guns get into the hands of criminals through smuggling, through theft, and through diversion. But I've also gone into other communities like Whitehorse and Red Deer and Kenora and visited those communities. And you'll recall at the very outset in my comments, I said that there really is in Canada only two legitimate reasons for firearm use in this country. And it's for hunting or it's for sport shooting purposes. And we know that there are many very responsible, law-abiding sports shooters in this country that use handguns very responsibly. They acquire them legally, store them securely, and are safe in their usage. And at the same time, we know that when guns get in the hands of people with violent criminal intent, they can be deadly. And so we are taking steps and to enact strong measures right across the country. But we're also respectful of the concerns that have been expressed to us by mayors in large centers and smaller communities, that the proliferation of handguns is deeply concerning to them, and they want to do more. They want to enact additional restrictions on where they can be possessed, where they can be used, how they can be transported. And that does not have the effect, I would submit, of creating a patchwork. It's just an acknowledgement that in some areas of the country, the circumstances are such that there are in heightened concern, legitimate concerns about the availability of handguns in those places. And so we want to work with them and support them in their efforts to keep their communities safe. And we also recognize it's an important discussion that needs to take place with the provinces and municipalities in that three orders of government relationship. We are taking strong steps to make sure that we keep handguns out of the hands of criminals by strengthening the restrictions placed upon them. And that's also with strengthening regulations that we brought forward in Bill C-71 in the previous Parliament, and that we are working diligently to implement fulsomely to make sure that we restrict access to these very dangerous weapons. And at the same time, we'll continue to work with municipalities to deal with the unique circumstances and concerns that many of them have expressed to us.
Thank you, Minister Blair. That concludes today's press conference.
Merci tout le monde.